Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 Drama, an early Christmas present from Christian Horner as he calls out the process with which decisions are made from the Formula 1 perspective, saying smaller teams have way too much power as it currently stands and wanting the budget cap raised for next season and beyond. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to discuss. Firstly, on the team car launches for next season, save the date, say Scuderia AlphaTauri, February the 11th in New York City is where they're unveiling their next year's car. We have 3 dates so far. AlphaTauri, as we just said, 11th of February, Aston Martin 13th of February, and then on the 14th, Valentine's Day, is the Ferrari, with the other team date as yet unconfirmed, and pre-season testing goes on a week or so after that in Bahrain, and then the first Grand Prix coming up not too long after that either. Now, speaking of the Mercedes front, they did reveal this. So yesterday's video, we discussed the fact that the W14 has now been fired up for the first time. They did a video on this, Mercedes, just like they did last year. And I mean, look, in fairness, people are saying, oh, you know, they've done the video again of them firing it up for the first time. Not a good sign. And it's very possible here that the audio in this clip is based on what the actual W14 sounds like. But the car doesn't have to be ready for them to do this. Theoretically, they could have used many parts here from the W13. Largely, at this time of year, the car will be getting there in terms of completion. So there's a decent chance they fired a fair bit of it up. But how many of these components we see in this video are actually related to this year's car and aren't just copied over from the W13 or aren't simply W13 parts they've put together here to fire this car up? Because, I mean, look, you don't really need that much to make the car go. Chuck an engine in. Would have been funny if they'd have chuck a V12 in there, right, to just kind of bait everyone with how it would sound. But, yeah, that was the video. So, obviously, you're not going to see much. And Mercedes are going to be very careful in anything they give away. They're going to very tightly control all of these frames in this image to ensure that nothing is seen here that couldn't potentially give any other teams any inkling or advantage into what they're planning for this season. But nonetheless, people did look into this to try and figure out this shot, especially whether these shots mean anything in terms of the way the car is laid out. This is a design that Craig Scarborough came up with, what he believes the W14 might look like. Of course, you'll notice it looks rather similar to this year's car, but you know, there are some differences that they might make in terms of around the rear. There's been some discussions as to whether where these fuel tanks are mounted, whether the way that it was done in the W13 was best for airflow. Of course, really, it's under the floor stuff where the difference probably will be made this year, but nonetheless, of course, like, the next year's car's going to look pretty similar to this year's car. It's the same set of regulations, and with no colour on this, it's kind of tough to tell how different this will look to the real thing. And of course, it's not like Craig Scarborough's been chilling there in the Mercedes headquarters to realise exactly what they are doing, but nonetheless, the slim side pod design, as you guys can see, probably getting copied over. Now, one thing to note here is that the W13, as I mentioned, had these higher mounted fuel tanks at the back of the car, and it seemed like a bit of an engineering marvel that they managed to have these very slim side pods and still fit everything into that compact package. And now I'm sure that's impressive from an engineering perspective. Now, whether it actually resulted in anything successful, that remains to be seen, as it didn't necessarily happen this season. But people did look into this still that we mentioned here from that video, suggesting that where this energy store is implies as well that there also will be the higher mounted fuel tanks. Now, whether they've literally just copied and pasted over the W13 bodywork onto the supposed W14 that they launched and revved up a couple of days ago, who knows? But that might be one indication as to the direction they're going, i.e. not changing much at all with next year's car, which is basically what Toto Wolff said a couple of weeks ago, right? He was like, yeah, the car looks the same in the wind tunnel, but the engineers tell me it's much better. So I guess he's got to take their word for that being the case. Now, one of their key rivals for next season, of course, the world champions in Red Bull, they have been under scrutiny this season. Been a very kind of dramatic season for them. The cost cap drama, the Verstappen Perez drama at the end of the season, plenty of other things have happened as well. Even the flexi floor stuff right earlier in the year. So they got the penalty for breaching the cost cap, and you know, Christian Horner has made it very clear many times that he wanted the cost cap raised. He even said at one point that even whatever the cost cap's going to be, teams are going to breach it and pay the fine, which is basically what they've done, although they will take a penalty, the effect of which remains to be seen. Now, one of the big changes that happened when Liberty Media came through to take over the management of Formula 1 is they changed the way decisions are made by the teams and also by the staff and the FA and all this type of stuff in terms of cost cap regulations, these type of decisions. It used to be the top 6 big teams used to have basically all the power, and the little teams, you know, as it stands, the Haas's, the Williams, let's say as it stands, wouldn't get much of a say in the, if that was to still be the case today. But you know, nowadays it's more equitable environment. But the top teams don't like that so much, obviously, because they get less power than they used to have in terms of making key decisions. So, of course, the cost cap was breached, and there's been some discussion on whether it benefited Red Bull significantly, whether it did not. Red Bull say that it didn't make any difference. David Croft actually mentioned just a couple of days ago that, yeah, it probably did make some difference because it simply can't not have done if the other teams didn't overspend and Red Bull still did. And now Christian Horner's discussed this further and wants to see changes to the way the budget cap is dealt with going forwards. First of all, wanting it increased in line with inflation, as we'll see in a second, but also talking about the smaller teams and why they have effectively too much impact on the sport. So this is the way it currently works. If there's a vote for the F1 committee to change things, this being, let's say, budget cap related, there are 30 votes distributed. 1 goes to each team, then 10 go to the F1 bosses, and 10 to the FIA, the governing body, effectively. So, 1 per team, right? Rather than being split in terms of how big the teams are, each team gets a fair shout in terms of rule changes. Now, Horner doesn't like this. The quote goes as following: "One could argue the little teams have too great a voice in implementing a significant rule that can affect the top teams with things that quite simply do not affect them, particularly through the budget cap." I think that's where the FIA and the promoter really need to take a look at. Talking about, technological partnerships have always been very important. And he talks about if you're trying to partner with a particular sponsor that wants to give you a new laptop, you can't necessarily always do that just because if those things come under the budget cap, you can't make that work. So kind of what he's saying is, and I think this is, it's understandable to a certain extent, that a team like Haas or even Alfa Romeo, they struggle to reach the cost cap, right? The $145 million per year budget cap. They struggle to reach that. Haas, I believe, might have spent 110 mil this past year or maybe the year before. There's been some rumors of their new partnership with, is it MoneyGram or something? They've got this new sponsorship deal, Haas, and that might allow them to actually get to the budget cap. But of course, they are incentivized to keep the budget cap as low as it possibly can be because they're not going to reach it. Whereas the top teams want it to be as high as possible because they can spend $400 million if they were allowed to. Now, I do think in the long term, this is good for the sport. It might take a year or two for the implications of the budget cap to take effect where the team should be on a more level playing field. And it's not like it's unexpected for Horner to say, oh, we think the cost cap should be higher. But nonetheless, it's an interesting statement saying that the small teams are kind of ruining things for the bigger teams by voting for changes that affect the bigger teams more than they affect themselves. It's only natural, but he believes the bigger team should have more voting power, kind of like how it used to be back in the day. Do you guys think that's right, though? Because at the end of the day, if we want the sport to be fairer and allow other teams to compete more, then, should the smaller teams just be cast aside as Horner seems to want them to be? Probably not, right? So that's an interesting statement, I thought. And he also goes on to say here that, the regulations are complicated, discussing the fact that there's certain element to the technical and sporting regulations that really do contribute to the cost cap. The fact that it takes, like 800 employees to get 2 cars on track every year, those things have to come within the cap. It's pretty difficult to achieve. And I thought he did make some interesting and pretty valid points about the fact that with inflation being high in the UK, if let's say the cost cap doesn't go up next year, that means that they can't really give any of their employees a pay rise. So their employees are basically getting unfairly affected here by the fact that their remuneration doesn't kind of go up with inflation as it might ideally do. So I thought some interesting points here he was mentioning, and also this one about the additional sprint races. I do think this is a fair point as well. With 23, maybe 24 races next season if China gets replaced occurring in 2023, then and also 6 sprint races as well now. Like, there is a lot to do, a lot of staffing to be had, and also a lot of spare parts you need just in case things go wrong during those additional races. So I can understand the push here from Horner and others to try and increase the cost cap, but by basically saying that what they should do is diminish the importance that the smaller teams have in any voting decisions probably isn't the right way to go about it, even though from Horner's perspective, I'm sure that would take things back to how maybe they used to be a few years ago when Eccleston was in charge, where the top teams had basically all the decisions. So, basically he said, get rid of these smaller teams, not get rid of them, of course, they're important for the sport, but make sure they can't make any big decisions is eventually the implication there, which, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with, but intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments section below. Now, one team that currently isn't doing so hot, but is intending to be a big team is Aston Martin. And just a quick note here what Alonso says, because I believe he's got a 2-year deal with Aston Martin. The guy's already like 41. I mean, how long is he going to be driving for? But he was on top of his game this past season, and he's actually said that to close the gap that Aston Martin have to the top of the table is unrealistic, but he's building for the future. So it's kind of funny, this young gun Alonso building for the future when he's already like in his 40s. But nonetheless, that seems to be his plan here, right? To say, look, Aston Martin, they're probably not going to be the fastest car on the grid next year, but within a year or two, couple of years, 2-3 years, he might have a car, hopefully, that's capable of winning races again season. I think, his talent certainly deserves it, and maybe Aston Martin can get there, but how long is he going to have to stay in this team for that to even be possible? And just along those lines, this I think was the race fans' top 20 list of drivers for the season, and pretty interesting here. Latifi, Riccardo, Schumacher, all of those three of course out. Then we've got Tsunoda and Zhou, who I think probably Zhou's performance here is fair enough, but I thought he had a really good season, to be honest. Gasly 14th, and then you go a little bit further up, but they've got Verstappen number 1, obviously, Norris 2nd, which I thought was pretty interesting to have him all the way at 2nd. Obviously Hamilton versus Russell is a controversial one. I'd probably say Hamilton above Russell, but Alonso 4th as well, so I don't know, that was their list regardless. And rating Alonso's performance very highly, that hopefully he can maintain as well. It's Christmas time tomorrow. Hopefully you guys have a great day if you are celebrating, and I'll be back on Boxing Day for more than likely another cracking update for the Formula 1 world. But hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.